What was supposed to be a quick stop at a roadside diner turns into a test where one mistake changes everything, and silence becomes the most dangerous choice. Watch till the end, subscribe for more hard-hitting stories, and comment where you're watching from. The road had been stretching ahead of them for hours, an unbroken ribbon of asphalt cutting through flat land and distant tree lines, the kind of road that invited routine and dulled vigilance through repetition. The car moved steadily, tires humming against the pavement, the world outside the windows sliding past in slow, familiar patterns. Chuck Norris drove without haste, hands resting lightly on the wheel, posture straight but relaxed, as though the miles themselves posed no challenge worth acknowledging. Long journeys never unsettled him. They gave him time to think, to observe, to fall into a rhythm where each decision felt measured and deliberate. His daughter sat beside him, leaning back against the seat, eyes half-lidded with exhaustion. She was no longer a child, no longer someone who needed to be guided through every moment. Yet the bond between them remained solid and unspoken. She carried the fatigue of travel differently, shifting often, stretching her legs when the road straightened, rubbing at her temples when the monotony grew heavy. They had spoken earlier, traded thoughts and memories, but as the hours passed, conversation gave way to silence. It was not an uncomfortable silence, but the kind that grew naturally between people who trusted each other enough not to fill every moment with words. The sun had begun its slow descent, light softening and losing its sharpness, casting long shadows across the road. Chuck noticed it without consciously thinking about it, the way he noticed everything. Fatigue crept in quietly, not as weakness, but as a reminder of time passing. He felt it in the slight stiffness of his shoulders and the dull ache behind his eyes. The need to stop, to eat, to rest even briefly became unavoidable. When the familiar shape of a roadside diner appeared in the distance, its low building outlined against the fading sky, Chuck eased off the accelerator. The place looked like dozens of others they had passed on other trips. A wide parking lot, a glowing sign dulled by years of weather, windows reflecting the last light of day. Nothing about it stood out, and that was precisely why it seemed suitable. Ordinary places promised ordinary outcomes, or so it often felt. He pulled into the lot and parked with care, choosing a space that offered a clear view of the entrance and the road beyond. The habit was old, ingrained through years of experience that had taught him to notice what others ignored. As they stepped out of the car, the air carried the faint smell of grease and coffee, mingling with the dust of the highway. The diner's door opened with a muted chime, welcoming them into a world that felt suspended in time. Inside, the diner was exactly what one would expect. Rows of red leather booths lined the walls, their surfaces worn smooth by countless patrons. Chrome accents reflected the overhead lights, and the counter stretched along one side, dotted with stools that had seen better days. Large panoramic windows ran along the opposite wall, allowing the fading daylight to spill in and soften the interior. A handful of customers occupied the booths and counter seats, each absorbed in their own quiet routines. Plates clinked softly, utensils scraped, and the low hum of conversation blended with the distant hiss of a coffee machine. Chuck paused just long enough to take in the layout. He noted the positions of the exits, the width of the aisles between booths, the way the counter partially blocked the line of sight from the kitchen. His gaze passed briefly over the patrons, cataloging them without judgment. A truck driver hunched over his meal, shoulders rounded from long hours behind the wheel. A couple sharing a booth near the window, speaking quietly. A man alone at the counter, staring into his coffee as though it held answers he had yet to find. Nothing unusual, nothing that demanded attention. He chose a booth slightly removed from the center of the room, close enough to the wall to limit movement behind them, positioned so he could see both the entrance and most of the dining area. His daughter slid into the seat across from him, stretching her legs beneath the table and exhaling slowly. The simple act of sitting brought relief, a release from the confined space of the car. As they settled in, Chuck felt the tension of the road begin to loosen its grip. The environment encouraged it. The predictable rhythm of the diner, the familiarity of its sights and sounds, created a sense of temporary refuge. It was the kind of place people stopped because they had no better option and no reason to expect trouble. He allowed himself to share in that assumption, if only partially. An overworked waitress moved between tables with practiced efficiency, her steps quick but her expression tired. She carried plates and mugs as though they were extensions of her hands, her attention divided among too many tasks. Chuck noticed the way her eyes flicked toward the door each time it opened, not from anticipation but from habit. It was a small detail, easily dismissed, but he stored it away nonetheless. While they waited for their food, Chuck leaned back slightly, resting his forearms on the table. His daughter glanced around the diner, taking in the scene with mild curiosity. To her, it was just another stop along the way, another forgettable place to be left behind once the meal was finished. She checked her phone briefly, then set it aside, rubbing at the back of her neck. The fatigue of travel weighed on her more openly now, and Chuck felt a familiar protective instinct stir, subtle but persistent. He reminded himself that this was an ordinary moment, a pause in the journey, nothing more. He had spent years learning to distinguish between real threats and imagined ones, between situations that demanded action and those that did not. At that moment, the diner fell squarely into the latter category. Time passed quietly. Plates were delivered, the smell of warm food filling the space between them. The first bites brought a welcome sense of normalcy, grounding them in the present. Outside, the sky continued to darken, the last of the daylight retreating behind distant buildings and trees. It was then that the door opened again, the chime cutting more sharply through the ambient noise than before. Chuck did not look up immediately. He did not need to. The shift in the room announced itself clearly enough. The volume rose, laughter too loud and too deliberate, footsteps heavier than necessary. The air itself seemed to change, thickening with an edge that had not been there moments earlier. Chuck's eyes moved to the entrance, calm and measured. A group of men had stepped inside, their presence filling the doorway. Leather vests, worn and adorned with patches, caught the light as they moved. Their posture spoke of confidence bordering on aggression, the kind that fed on attention. They scanned the room openly, not searching for seats so much as for acknowledgement. Around the diner, subtle reactions rippled outward. Conversations faltered, shoulders stiffened, heads turned away too quickly to appear casual. The waitress hesitated for a fraction of a second before resuming her work, her movements slightly more rigid now. The sense of refuge that had settled over the room began to erode, replaced by an unspoken awareness that something unpredictable had entered the space. Chuck observed without alarm. He noted their number, the way they spread out, how one of them lingered a step behind the others, watching rather than engaging. He did not react outwardly, did not shift in his seat or change his expression. Experience had taught him that attention, even wary attention, could invite problems as easily as provoke them. His daughter noticed the change too, though she could not have articulated it in the same way. She glanced toward the door, then back at her plate, her posture tightening slightly. Chuck caught the movement and met her eyes briefly, offering a steady look meant to reassure without words. For the moment, reassurance felt appropriate. The bikers moved deeper into the diner, voices carrying as they claimed a cluster of booths toward the back. Chairs scraped loudly against the floor, laughter erupted again, and the fragile calm of the room fractured further. Chuck returned his attention to his meal, maintaining the appearance of indifference. Internally, he continued to assess, to weigh possibilities without committing to any of them. This was still, he told himself, an ordinary stop. The presence of loud, unpleasant people did not automatically mean danger. Not yet. He had chosen this place for its simplicity, its predictability, and he held on to the belief that predictability would prevail. Yet even as he finished his meal, a quiet awareness lingered at the edges of his mind. The road had taught him many things, among them that ordinary moments could shift without warning. For now he allowed the scene to unfold on its own, trusting his judgment and the habits that had kept him steady for so long. The journey, after all, was far from over. The diner did not become a different place the moment they arrived. The booths remained red and worn, the windows still held the fading light, the smell of coffee and fried food still lingered in the air. Yet the sense of it changed all the same, as if something unseen had slid into the room and taken a seat among the ordinary. The sound of their entrance stayed behind them like a shadow. Even after the chime of the door settled and the first burst of laughter softened into rough conversation, The room carried the knowledge of them, and nothing could quite return to the easy rhythm it had been following a minute before. Chuck remained where he was, neither stiffening nor relaxing more than he already had. He did not turn to watch them in a way that would draw attention, but his awareness tracked their movement with quiet precision. It was not a matter of fear. It was habit, sharpened by years of recognizing patterns long before they became problems. A group like that did not simply sit down and vanish into the background. They arrived as a disturbance, and they tended to measure a place by the way it responded to them. They moved toward the back booths as though the entire diner had been arranged for their convenience. The men were not young, not reckless boys playing at danger, but grown men with the heavy confidence of people who had learned that intimidation often worked better than force. Their leather vests hung open over t-shirts, their arms marked by tattoos that seemed less decoration than declaration. Some carried themselves with swagger, shoulders wide, heads high, as though waiting for someone to challenge them. Others moved with a lazier menace, grinning as they passed, as if daring the room to show discomfort. The back booths were claimed quickly. A chair scraped loud enough to turn heads. One of them dropped into a seat and leaned back, taking up space. Another stretched his legs into the aisle, forcing a passing customer to shift around him. It was a small act, petty and almost childish, but it served its purpose. The message was clear. They would not make room. The world would move around them. A waitress passed with a tray balanced on her palm, her expression carefully neutral. She glanced at them with the tight awareness of someone who had seen this kind of group before. She did not stop, did not challenge their sprawl into the walkway, only angled her body and slipped past. Her movement was practiced, and that practice suggested experience, perhaps too much of it. Chuck noticed the slight tightening around her eyes as she did it, the way her mouth pressed into a thin line. He also noticed how quickly she looked away once she had cleared them, as though avoiding eye contact would lessen the risk of being pulled into their orbit. Their voices rose again. Laughter came in bursts, louder than it needed to be. Something about it felt performative, as if they were not laughing because something was funny, but because they wanted to be heard. They spoke to each other with broad gestures, hands flashing as they emphasized points, elbows jostling, shoulders bumping, a show of belonging that could easily turn into a show of dominance. Chuck's daughter kept her attention on her food, but the change had reached her as well. It was in the way her movements became more careful, in the way she paused before lifting her drink, in the quiet tension that settled in her shoulders. She did not look frightened in an obvious way, but she looked alert, like someone who had stepped into a room and realized the mood could shift at any moment. Chuck watched her for a moment, then returned his gaze to the general space, ensuring she did not feel watched as though she were fragile. Protecting someone did not always mean hovering. Sometimes it meant letting them breathe while you took the weight of awareness onto yourself. Across the diner, a man at the counter shifted on his stool and stared down at his coffee. A couple by the window leaned closer together, their conversation fading into murmurs. A customer nearer the back rose sooner than he seemed to have planned, leaving half his fries untouched, and walked toward the register with a forced casualness. The room did not make a scene, but it adjusted in 100 small ways. The ordinary rearranged itself around the threat of discomfort. The bikers seemed to feed on that adjustment. One of them leaned into the aisle again, not out of fatigue, but out of deliberate intrusion. Another slapped the table and laughed, his voice booming so sharply that a woman at a nearby booth flinched before catching herself. A third called the waitress back with an impatient wave, not waiting for her to finish with another table. The act was not violent, but it carried an edge. It said they expected obedience, and they would not tolerate being treated like everyone else. Chuck's eyes passed over them again, cataloging details without allowing his expression to change. There were 6 of them in total. 2 were louder than the others, the ones most eager to perform. One sat with a measured stillness, watching the room with a slow, deliberate gaze. Another, the largest, had the posture of someone who enjoyed the fear he caused. He leaned forward and back as he spoke, his grin wide, his movements heavy. The leader was not the loudest, Chuck judged. The leader was the one the others checked, the one whose laugh came last, the one who did not need to raise his voice to command attention. For a while they stayed contained in their corner, making noise, spilling their presence across the room without stepping fully into it. In another situation, it might have ended there. Some groups came in rough and loud, then settled once they had eaten. But these men carried something else. Their manner was not that of people looking for a meal. It was that of people looking to confirm their power. The proof of that came in small tests. One of them nudged a napkin dispenser off the edge of the table and watched it hit the floor, not bothering to pick it up. He looked around, expecting a reaction. Another stretched his arm into the aisle and let his knuckles brush the shoulder of a passing customer, an almost accidental touch made purposeful by the slow grin that followed. The customer kept moving. No one spoke. The biker's grin widened as though he had won something. Chuck felt the familiar internal calculation begin. Not hurried, not anxious, simply precise. He measured distances. He noted the positions of the nearest tables, the counter, the open space between booths. He watched the waitress as she moved, watched how she delayed approaching their table until she could no longer avoid it. He observed the other patrons and how quickly they could become obstacles or witnesses. He did not plan for violence. He planned for possibility, because possibility was what kept people alive. His daughter finished what was on her plate and wiped her hands with a napkin. She did not rush, but she moved in the way of someone who wanted to leave as soon as it would look natural. Chuck understood. The instinct to remove yourself from a situation before it turned unpleasant was not weakness. It was wisdom. He had made the same choice countless times in his life, stepping away from conflicts that offered nothing but chaos. He was about to stand and signal that they should go when the waitress approached their booth again, dropping off a refill without lingering. Her hand trembled just slightly as she set the coffee down. Not enough for most people to notice, but enough for Chuck to register. She offered no smile, only the tight professionalism of someone trying to make it through her shift without drawing attention from the wrong people. As she moved away, one of the bikers called out again. Chuck did not hear the words clearly, but he heard the tone. It was not a request. It was a demand coded in false humor. The waitress slowed, hesitated, then turned back, forced into engagement by the weight of their attention. A ripple moved through the diner. A few people glanced up, then quickly looked down again. Someone at a booth nearer the middle shifted as though debating whether to leave, then stayed. The tension was not dramatic yet. It was not a scene of shouting and shattered glass. It was subtler than that, a tightening thread drawn across the room, ready to snap. Chuck watched the group's body language rather than their faces. He saw the way one of them leaned in closer, invading the waitress's space. He saw the way another smirked and turned his head toward the room, gauging who was watching. He saw how quickly the waitress stepped back when she could, retreating toward the kitchen with the forced speed of someone trying not to run. When she vanished behind the swinging door, the biker's laughter followed her. It did not sound like pleasure. It sounded like ownership. Chuck's daughter shifted her gaze toward them for the first time, not staring, just a brief glance that carried annoyance and unease. She looked back at her father. Chuck met her eyes calmly, and in that look he communicated what he had always communicated in moments like this. Stay steady, stay aware, do not invite attention. He did not need to speak. The bond between them did not require explanation. They sat in silence for a moment longer, listening to the diner settle into a strained imitation of normal. Outside, the last daylight faded further, and the windows began to reflect more of the interior than the world beyond. The diner became a smaller universe, enclosed by glass and walls, its atmosphere shaped by whoever imposed themselves most strongly. At the back, the bikers grew bolder. Their noise increased, their movements more expansive. One rose from his booth and wandered toward the restroom, walking slowly down the aisle as if he owned it. He brushed his fingers along the tops of the booths as he passed, not touching anyone directly, but close enough that people stiffened when he came near. He paused by an empty booth in the middle and leaned over it, peering at the untouched condiments, then laughed to himself and kept moving. A man near the counter paid his check and left quickly, his eyes fixed on the door. When he passed the bikers, he did not look at them. He did not look at anyone. He simply walked faster until the chime sounded and he disappeared into the parking lot. Chuck felt the room shifting toward a decision point. Places like this could go one of two ways. Either the tension dissipated as the disruptive group grew bored, or it sharpened into confrontation because boredom was what they feared most. People who sought dominance rarely wanted a quiet outcome. They wanted proof, witnesses, the satisfaction of seeing someone else flinch. He watched the largest biker, the one whose posture suggested he enjoyed causing fear. The man's eyes moved across the diner in slow sweeps, lingering on people in a way that made them uncomfortable. His grin appeared and vanished, as if he were tasting the moment. He looked like someone who had learned that the world often stepped aside for him, and he enjoyed the habit too much to let it pass without reward. Chuck's daughter glanced toward the door again, then down at her hands. Chuck noticed the slight tremor in her fingers as she folded the napkin. It was small, but it mattered. She was trying to keep control of herself, to remain composed. Chuck felt a steady anger rise, not explosive, not blinding, but focused. Not at her, not at the diner, not even at the existence of people like the bikers. It was anger at the idea that his daughter had to measure her movements and tighten her shoulders simply because a group of strangers chose to spread their cruelty across a room. He did not act on it. Not yet. Anger was a tool only if it remained contained. The bikers finally ordered food, but even that became a performance. They waved the waitress over with impatience, spoke loudly enough for half the diner to hear, laughed at each other's crude remarks. The waitress nodded and wrote quickly, her expression blank, then hurried away. The kitchen door swung, and for a moment the sound of plates and the sizzle of the grill rose above the noise, as though the diner tried to return to its usual rhythm. But the tension remained because the group did not truly care about eating. Food was an excuse. The real hunger was for control. Chuck considered leaving. They could stand, pay, and walk out before anything worse happened. It would be the sensible choice. The road was long, the night was coming, and there would be other diners, other stops. Yet leaving now would mean walking past them. It would mean exposing his daughter to their attention as she moved through the aisle, and that thought narrowed his focus. Sometimes staying seated, staying still, was safer than drawing notice by moving. He measured the timing, the angles, the likelihood of being seen. While he calculated, one of the bikers turned his head slightly and looked toward Chuck's booth. The glance was brief, almost casual, but it carried an assessing quality. It lingered a fraction longer than it needed to. Chuck did not respond. He continued his calm posture, neither challenging nor shrinking. The biker's eyes moved on. Chuck felt the faintest shift in his daughter beside him, the instinctive tightening that came when you realized you had been noticed. He held his stillness, anchoring the space around them. The diner's lights hummed softly overhead. The outside world had darkened enough that the windows now reflected the booths and faces more clearly than the parking lot. The room felt enclosed, as though they were all trapped inside this moment together. At the back, laughter erupted again, louder than before. A chair scraped hard against the floor, and a biker stood, moving into the aisle with a swaggering ease. He adjusted his vest as he walked, letting it swing open, letting his tattoos catch the light. He looked around as he moved, not searching for a destination so much as searching for eyes on him. And as he passed the midpoint of the diner, his gaze began to settle, slower and more deliberate, drifting toward the booths where people still tried to pretend they were alone. Chuck watched him approach, still calm, still composed. He did not change his expression. He did not reach for anything. He simply observed, and in that observation he felt the tension tighten one more degree. The moment of inconvenience and noise was shifting into something more personal, something chosen. The biker's steps slowed as he neared Chuck's section of the diner. His grin surfaced again, faint and sharp. He glanced across the booths as though selecting a target in plain sight. Chuck's awareness narrowed, not into panic, but into readiness. His daughter sat straighter, her shoulders drawing in, her breath held for a beat. The diner for a moment seemed to hold its breath with them. The ordinary stop had not yet become a crisis, but it was no longer ordinary. It was now a place where something was about to be tested, and the room would learn, one way or another, who would break first. The biker did not stop immediately. He drifted down the aisle with deliberate slowness, his boots striking the floor just loudly enough to draw attention, without crossing into outright confrontation. It was the kind of movement meant to be noticed, meant to remind everyone in the room that he was there, and that he did not need permission to be. His eyes moved lazily from booth to booth, lingering for a second too long on faces that quickly turned away. Each pause was a test, each step an invitation for fear to surface. Chuck remained still, his posture unchanged, his expression calm. He watched the man approach through the reflection in the window beside him, rather than turning his head outright. It was a small choice, but an intentional one. Turning too openly could be read as a challenge. Ignoring him completely could be read as weakness. Chuck chose the narrow path in between, the one that offered awareness without provocation. His daughter sensed the approach before she fully understood it. She felt it in the way the air around their booth seemed to tighten, in the subtle shift of sound as nearby conversations faded. Her shoulders drew inward, and she adjusted her position on the seat. A reflexive movement to make herself smaller, less visible. She did not look up right away. She knew instinctively that looking too soon might invite attention she did not want. The biker slowed as he reached the row of booths near them. He rested one hand briefly on the top of a seat, fingers drumming against the worn leather. The sound was soft, but it carried in the quiet that had begun to spread through the diner. A few booths away, someone coughed nervously. The waitress had retreated behind the counter, pretending to wipe a surface that did not need cleaning. The biker's gaze finally settled, not on Chuck, but on his daughter. It was not a glance filled with curiosity or interest in the ordinary sense. It was a look of appraisal, of possession imagined rather than earned. His mouth curved slightly, a grin that carried no warmth. He did not speak yet. He simply looked, taking his time, enjoying the discomfort that rippled outward from his attention. Chuck felt the shift immediately. His awareness sharpened, narrowing its focus without abandoning the wider room. He noted the biker's distance, the angle of his body, the position of his hands. He felt the familiar internal calculation resume, precise and unemotional. Still, he did nothing. Not yet. A single look, however unpleasant, was not enough to justify action. He had learned long ago that reacting too early could be as dangerous as reacting too late. His daughter lifted her eyes then, meeting the biker's gaze for the briefest moment before looking away. The movement was instinctive, defensive. She turned her attention to the table, fingers curling slightly against the edge. Her breathing grew shallow, though she worked to steady it. She was aware of Chuck beside her, aware of his presence like an anchor, and she leaned subtly toward him without fully realizing she had done so. The biker noticed. The grin widened a fraction. He took a step closer, invading the space between booths, leaning in just enough that his shadow fell across the table. The smell of leather and stale alcohol reached them. He still did not speak. Silence, Chuck knew, could be a weapon. It forced others to fill it with their fear. Around them, the diner continued its quiet retreat. A man 2 booths away slid out of his seat and moved toward the counter, murmuring an apology as he passed his tablemate. Another customer pretended to check his phone, angling the screen away as though the device itself might offer protection. The staff remained behind the counter and in the kitchen, their absence from the floor conspicuous. Chuck's mind moved through possibilities. Leaving now would mean standing up, stepping into the aisle, and passing close to the biker. That would bring his daughter directly into the man's reach. Staying seated allowed Chuck to control the immediate space around them, to keep the table between the biker and his daughter for the moment. He chose to stay. The biker leaned a little closer, resting his forearm on the back of the booth across from them. The movement was casual, almost lazy, but it was a clear violation of boundaries. His eyes remained fixed on the girl, ignoring Chuck entirely. That too was deliberate. To acknowledge Chuck would mean recognizing him as a potential obstacle. Ignoring him suggested the biker had already dismissed him as irrelevant. Chuck did not respond to the provocation. He did not straighten or tense. He allowed his stillness to speak for him, though he knew it might not be heard the way he intended. Some men understood silence as restraint. Others understood it as surrender. The biker seemed to fall into the latter category. After a moment, the biker straightened and took another step, this time moving past their booth as though he had lost interest. The tension did not release. If anything, it sharpened. Chuck knew the tactic well. Retreat, then return stronger. The biker's boots continued down the aisle, and he disappeared briefly toward the restroom at the back of the diner. His daughter let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. Her hands relaxed slightly, though the tremor did not fully fade. She glanced at Chuck, her eyes searching his face for cues. Chuck met her gaze calmly and gave a subtle nod, an unspoken reassurance that he was aware and present. He did not smile. Smiling would have felt dishonest. The biker returned a few minutes later. This time, he did not walk alone. One of the others followed at a distance, watching the room with open interest. They stopped again near Chuck's booth, closer now than before. The lead biker leaned against the empty booth across the aisle, crossing his arms, blocking part of the walkway. His companion stood slightly behind him, angled toward the room, a silent audience. The lead biker finally spoke, his voice low but clear enough to carry. It was not loud. It did not need to be. The tone was mocking, invasive, designed to draw a reaction. Chuck did not respond. He kept his gaze forward, his attention on his daughter, though he could feel the biker's eyes burning into the side of his face. The biker laughed softly, as though amused by his own words. He leaned in again, this time closer, his hands sliding along the top of the booth. The distance between his fingers and the girl's hair narrowed to inches. Chuck's internal count reached a quiet threshold. He felt the line approaching, the one that could not be crossed without consequence. His daughter shifted again, trying to put more space between herself and the man, but the booth limited her movement. She angled her body away, her shoulder pressing lightly against Chuck's arm. Her jaw tightened and she swallowed, fighting the instinct to stand and flee. Standing would only make her more exposed. Chuck placed his hand gently on the table, palm down, a grounding presence. He did not look at the biker. He did not speak. He was buying time, hoping against reason that the man would grow bored, that the group would retreat back to their corner. It was a slim hope, but it was the only one that did not involve escalation. The biker misread the gesture entirely. He took Chuck's stillness as confirmation that there would be no resistance. His grin returned, wider now, emboldened. He leaned in one final step, close enough that his breath brushed the air near the girl's face. The diner seemed to contract around them, walls and booths closing in, sound fading until only the pulse of blood and the scrape of leather remained. Around them, people froze. A fork clattered to a plate and went unnoticed. Someone near the counter whispered something urgent, but the words dissolved before reaching anyone who might act on them. The waitress watched from behind the counter, her face pale, hands clenched around a coffee pot she did not pour. Chuck felt the shift in his daughter's body before he saw it. Her muscles tensed sharply, her breath caught, her instinct screaming that the space around her was no longer safe. The biker's hand hovered, then moved with sudden decisiveness, fingers reaching past the boundary that had held for seconds too long. In that instant, time seemed to slow. Chuck registered every detail with painful clarity. The angle of the biker's wrist, the way his fingers spread, the widening of his daughter's eyes as realization struck, the way the room collectively recoiled. Too late, too hesitant. The biker's hand closed around her hair. The movement was not violent at first. It was not a wild yank or a dramatic blow. It was a calculated act, meant to assert control, to humiliate rather than injure. His fingers tightened, pulling just enough to force her head back, to make her gasp. Pain flared instantly, sharp and undeniable. Her scream tore through the diner, raw and uncontrolled. It shattered the fragile stillness that had held the room together. Chairs scraped back violently. Someone shouted. The sound echoed against the walls, filling the space with shock and disbelief. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Chuck did not shout. He did not hesitate. The moment his daughter's cry reached him, something within him shifted completely. The calculation ended. The waiting stopped. What remained was clarity. He turned toward the biker at last. The diner seemed to hold its breath as Chuck rose from his seat, his movement smooth and deliberate, his expression unchanged. The man holding his daughter's hair did not release his grip. He did not yet understand what he had done. That understanding was about to arrive. For a fraction of a second after the scream, the diner existed in a strange suspension, as though the sound had torn through time itself and left everyone uncertain of what was supposed to come next. The cry hung in the air, raw and unmistakable, stripping away the last illusion of normalcy. Conversations died instantly. Plates sat untouched. Every eye in the room turned toward the booth, where the ordinary had finally broken. The biker's hand was still tangled in the girl's hair. His grip tightened reflexively when she screamed, not out of strategy, but out of instinct, as though he feared losing the control he had just claimed. Her head was pulled back at an unnatural angle, pain flashing across her face in a way no one in the room could ignore. Her hands flew upward, fingers clawing uselessly at his wrist, her body straining away from him, while the confines of the booth betrayed her. Chuck saw all of it with brutal clarity. The sound of her voice cut through him more sharply than any physical blow ever could. In that moment, the diner ceased to be a public place, ceased to be governed by social restraint or the unspoken rules that kept people polite. It became something smaller and more intimate, reduced to the space immediately around his daughter and the man hurting her. He stood. The movement was unhurried, almost calm, and that calmness carried more weight than any sudden outburst could have. The bench seat slid back beneath him with a muted scrape, but the sound barely registered against the pounding silence that followed the scream. Chuck did not rush. He did not lunge. His body rose smoothly, his posture straight, his presence expanding into the space he had just claimed. The biker noticed then. His eyes flicked toward Chuck for the first time, registering him not as background, not as furniture, but as a living obstacle. Surprise flashed across his face, quickly followed by irritation. He opened his mouth as if to say something, perhaps a threat, perhaps a joke meant to reclaim the upper hand. The words never came. Chuck's attention was not on the biker's face. It was on his hand, on the fingers embedded in his daughter's hair, on the tension in her neck and shoulders. He moved closer, stepping into the narrow gap between the booths with a precision born of long experience. His body positioned itself instinctively, blocking the biker's line of access to his daughter's body while still allowing him the leverage he needed. Around them, the diner erupted into chaos and paralysis all at once. Chairs scraped violently as people recoiled or stood. Someone shouted for the man to let go. Another voice cried out for the police. The waitress froze behind the counter, her hand clamped over her mouth, eyes wide with horror. A man near the door fumbled for his phone, hands shaking as he tried to dial. None of it mattered to Chuck. He reached out and placed one hand firmly around the biker's wrist. His grip was not frantic. It was precise, fingers closing around bone and tendon in a way that instantly disrupted strength. The biker laughed reflexively, a sharp, mocking sound that carried no real confidence. He tried to pull back, to jerk his arm free, but Chuck's hand did not move. The biker's expression shifted as realization dawned. This was not resistance born of fear or desperation. This was control. Chuck twisted the wrist just enough to force the biker's fingers to loosen. The pressure was exact, applied at an angle that punished leverage rather than flesh. The biker grunted, surprise giving way to pain, and his grip on the girl's hair broke. She collapsed forward, gasping, her hands flying to her head as she instinctively shielded herself. Chuck did not let go. He stepped forward another half step, using his body to put himself fully between the biker and his daughter. His shoulder turned slightly, his stance widening, grounding himself. With a smooth, practiced motion, he redirected the biker's arm downward and away, breaking the man's balance and forcing him to stumble. The biker swore loudly now, his free hand flailing as he tried to recover. The second biker, who had been standing nearby, reacted late. He lunged forward with a shout, his intent obvious, his movement reckless. Chuck saw him in his peripheral vision and adjusted without conscious thought. He released the first biker's wrist just long enough to pivot, using the narrow aisle and the edge of the booth to limit the second man's approach. The first biker tried to surge forward again, fury replacing surprise. Chuck met him with a short, decisive movement, a controlled strike that stopped momentum rather than chased it. The impact drove the air from the man's lungs and sent him crashing back against the booth behind him. The leather creaked under the sudden weight, and the table rattled violently. The room erupted fully then. People shouted, some in fear, some in encouragement. A woman near the window screamed again when the biker hit the booth. The waitress dropped a tray behind the counter, the crash of dishes punctuating the chaos. Someone finally managed to push through the paralysis and run for the door, calling out as they went. Chuck remained focused. He shifted again, placing one hand behind him without looking, guiding his daughter away from the immediate danger. She stumbled back, shaken, but she moved when he guided her, instinctively trusting his direction. He positioned her behind him, close to the wall of the booth, where she was shielded from the direct line of movement. The biker who had grabbed her recovered enough to stand upright, his face twisted with rage and humiliation. He reached toward Chuck again, his movements less controlled now, driven by emotion rather than intent. Chuck met him calmly, stepping into the attack instead of away from it, cutting off the distance and denying the biker the space he needed to generate force. The clash was brief and violent, but not chaotic. Chuck's movements were economical, each action serving a purpose. He redirected blows, disrupted balance, and used the confined space to his advantage. The biker stumbled again, this time harder, his knee striking the floor as he fell. The sound echoed sharply, a dull thud that silenced a few of the surrounding shouts. The other bikers were finally reacting in earnest. Chairs were shoved aside as two of them rose from the back booths, anger and confusion warring on their faces. They had expected dominance, not resistance. They had expected fear, not control. The sudden reversal left them scrambling to reassert themselves. Chuck saw them coming. He adjusted his position, angling his body so that the narrow aisle and the table created a barrier. He did not pursue the fallen biker. He did not strike unnecessarily. His objective was clear and limited. Stop the threat, protect his daughter, prevent escalation from spreading to the rest of the room. One of the bikers lunged forward, attempting to grab Chuck from behind. Chuck sensed the movement and dropped his center of gravity, shifting his weight just enough to make the grab ineffective. The biker's hands brushed his jacket, but found no purchase. Chuck turned sharply, using the man's forward momentum against him, and sent him stumbling into a chair that collapsed under the impact. The sound of splintering wood and metal rang through the diner. Gasps followed, sharp and frightened. Someone shouted again for the police. Another voice pleaded for it to stop. The diner had become a storm of noise and motion, but within it, Chuck moved with controlled precision, a steady center in the chaos. The biker who had first attacked tried to rise again, spitting curses, his bravado unraveling. Chuck closed the distance once more and delivered a final, decisive blow that dropped the man fully to the floor. He did not linger. He did not continue once the threat was neutralized. He stepped back immediately, reestablishing space, his attention already shifting to the remaining bikers. They hesitated. For the first time since they had entered the diner, uncertainty crept into their movements. They saw the fallen men, saw the way the room had turned against them, saw the phones raised now, recording. The illusion of control they had brought with them cracked visibly. Chuck stood between them and his daughter, breathing evenly, his posture firm. He did not threaten them. He did not advance. He simply held his ground. The silence that followed was different from the one before the scream. It was not frozen. It was wary. The bikers exchanged glances, their earlier confidence draining away as reality asserted itself. This was no longer a game, no longer a performance for a fearful audience. This was a situation with consequences. Sirens wailed faintly in the distance, barely audible through the walls but unmistakable once noticed. Someone had finally made the call. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, reminding everyone that the outside world was rushing back in. Chuck remained where he was, one hand still extended slightly behind him, feeling the presence of his daughter close and alive. He did not pursue the bikers as they backed away, did not savor the moment. His role was complete. The line had been crossed, and he had answered it. What came next would belong to the law, to witnesses, to the aftermath that followed violence, no matter how justified. The diner breathed again, shakily as the immediate danger receded, but nothing about it would ever feel ordinary in quite the same way. The moment after the bikers hesitated did not feel like relief. It felt like the sharp intake of breath before another wave crashed. The diner was no longer frozen, but it had not yet found its footing again. Sound returned unevenly, voices overlapping, chairs scraping, the brittle clatter of nerves snapping under pressure. The smell of spilled coffee and sweat mingled with the grease from the kitchen, creating an atmosphere thick enough to taste. Chuck did not relax. He understood better than anyone that hesitation could turn back into violence in an instant. He stayed where he was, feet planted, body angled to shield his daughter, eyes moving constantly. He tracked the remaining bikers with calm precision, watching their shoulders, their hands, the subtle shifts that preceded reckless decisions. His breathing remained even, deliberate, a quiet anchor in the chaos. Behind him, his daughter struggled to steady herself. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her head, fingers brushing through her hair in disbelief, checking for injury. Pain throbbed where the biker's grip had been, a dull ache that pulsed with each heartbeat. She fought the urge to cry, not out of shame, but out of instinct, the need to stay composed in a room that still felt dangerous. When she took a step back, Chuck felt it immediately, adjusting his stance without turning, guiding her farther behind him, closer to the wall where the booth met the corner. One of the bikers barked something unintelligible, a curse wrapped in frustration. Another took a half step forward, then stopped himself, eyes flicking toward the fallen men on the floor. The sight of their companions, groaning and struggling to rise, had changed the calculation. The confidence that had carried them into the diner had cracked, replaced by the dawning realization that the room was no longer theirs. A man near the counter finally found his voice, shouting for everyone to stay back. His words were raw and panicked, but they cut through the noise. Someone else echoed him, louder this time, urging the bikers to leave. The chorus grew unevenly, courage spreading not all at once, but in hesitant bursts, as though people were testing whether it was safe to speak. Chuck's attention flicked briefly toward the door. It remained closed, but he knew help was on the way. He had heard the sirens, too, faint at first, then clearer, threading their way through the night. Time stretched oddly, compressing and expanding, each second heavy with possibility. The biker who had grabbed his daughter tried to rise again. He pushed himself onto his elbows, teeth clenched, face twisted with pain and humiliation. His eyes burned with anger, searching for something to blame, something to strike. When he looked up and met Chuck's gaze, the anger faltered. What he saw there was not triumph or rage, but something far worse for a man like him: control. Chuck took a step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, but enough to remind the man on the floor that he was not free to rejoin the fight. The biker's shoulders sagged slightly as the effort of defiance drained out of him. He rolled onto his side with a groan, clutching his ribs, the fight finally leaving his body. Two of the remaining bikers exchanged looks. One glanced toward the door again, clearly calculating escape. The other's jaw tightened, pride warring with fear. He took a breath as if to speak, then stopped, his eyes catching on the raised phones around the diner. Screens glowed faintly in the dim light. Lenses pointed steadily in their direction. The audience they had wanted was there after all, but it was no longer cheering. Chuck held his position. He did not advance, did not taunt, did not demand anything. He simply remained between the bikers and his daughter, a quiet statement of boundary that did not require explanation. His presence alone seemed to sap the will from the confrontation. The sirens grew louder, no longer distant. Blue and red light flickered briefly across the windows, reflections dancing along chrome and glass. The sound carried authority, consequence, the end of the moment's lawlessness. It settled over the diner like a final judgment. One of the bikers cursed under his breath and stepped back fully, hands raised slightly in a gesture that hovered between surrender and frustration. Another followed suit, backing away toward the rear booths, eyes never leaving Chuck. They did not turn their backs. They retreated carefully, as though afraid that a sudden movement might draw him forward again. The room exhaled collectively, though the tension did not disappear entirely. It shifted, becoming something like aftermath, the uneasy quiet that followed a storm. People began to move more freely now, some stepping around fallen chairs, others helping right overturned tables. A woman near the window knelt beside one of the injured bikers, hesitating, then reaching out to check if he was breathing. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, but she did not look away. Chuck finally turned his head enough to check on his daughter directly. Their eyes met, and in that brief exchange, words passed between them that did not need to be spoken. She was shaken, frightened, hurting, but she was standing. She was alive. He nodded once, a small, steadying gesture, and she nodded back, drawing a deeper breath. The first police cruiser pulled into the parking lot, tires crunching against gravel. The sirens cut off abruptly, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. A moment later, the diner door opened, and two officers stepped inside, their presence immediate and commanding. They took in the scene in seconds. The fallen bikers, the overturned furniture, the crowd pressed back against walls and booths, phones still raised. "Everyone stay where you are," one of them called out, his voice firm but controlled. The other moved toward the injured men, radio crackling as he called for medical assistance. The authority in their movements anchored the room, drawing a clear line between what had been chaos and what would now be procedure. Chuck stepped back slightly, creating space, careful to keep his daughter within arm's reach. He raised his hands just enough to show he was not a threat, his movements deliberate and calm. He did not feel the need to explain himself yet. The truth was already written across the room in a dozen witness accounts and a handful of recordings. An officer approached him, eyes scanning, posture cautious. Chuck met his gaze steadily, answering questions with concise clarity. He described what had happened without embellishment, without emotion, focusing on actions and sequence. His voice was even, grounded, the voice of someone who understood that facts carried more weight than anger. Around them, people began to speak up. At first it was tentative, a few voices overlapping, then more confident as the officers gestured for order. The waitress stepped forward, her hands still trembling, and confirmed what she had seen. The couple by the window added their account. The man who had nearly left earlier returned from the door, emboldened now, and spoke as well. Each statement reinforced the same truth, forming a solid narrative that left little room for doubt. The bikers' attempts to reclaim control faltered completely under the scrutiny. One of them tried to protest, slurring his words, insisting it had all been a misunderstanding. The officer shut him down with a look, directing him to sit and wait. Another biker remained silent, staring at the floor, his shoulders slumped, the fight gone from him entirely. Paramedics arrived next, moving efficiently through the diner with stretchers and equipment. They checked the injured men quickly, their professionalism cutting through the remaining tension. One biker was loaded onto a stretcher, groaning softly as he was secured. Another sat on the floor, leaning against a booth, holding an ice pack to his face. As the immediate urgency eased, the weight of what had happened began to settle over Chuck and his daughter. Adrenaline drained away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Chuck felt it in his limbs, a heaviness that reminded him he was not immune to the cost of action, no matter how controlled. He placed a steady hand on his daughter's shoulder, grounding them both. She leaned into the touch briefly, then straightened, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Her eyes moved around the diner, taking in the broken furniture, the blood on the floor, the people watching them with a mixture of gratitude and awe. The reality of it all pressed in, and she swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay present. An officer asked if she needed medical attention. She shook her head, then hesitated, then nodded slightly when he insisted. A paramedic examined her carefully, checking her scalp and neck, speaking softly, reassuring her that the pain would fade. Chuck watched closely, his jaw tight, ready to intervene if needed, though the danger had clearly passed. As statements were taken and paperwork began, the diner slowly transformed again. It did not return to normal. It could not, but it shifted into something quieter, more reflective. People spoke in low voices now, sharing fragments of shock and relief. Someone offered the waitress a glass of water. Another customer picked up a fallen chair and set it upright. The officers finished their initial work and began escorting the bikers out, one by one, hands cuffed, faces sullen. The sound of boots on the floor echoed heavily, each step a reminder of consequences finally taking shape. When the door closed behind the last of them, the room felt lighter, as though a pressure had been released. Chuck stood with his daughter near their booth, waiting until they were told they were free to leave. He did not feel victorious. He felt tired and resolute, and deeply aware of how close the moment had come to becoming something far worse. He looked at his daughter again, saw the strength in her eyes beneath a lingering shock, and felt a quiet pride settle in his chest. Outside, the night had fully claimed the sky. Blue and red lights washed across the parking lot, reflecting off the diner's windows in fading pulses. The road stretched beyond, dark and indifferent, waiting for them to return to it. The worst was over. What remained was consequence, memory, and the slow work of putting things back together. The diner did not empty all at once. After the police finished their initial work and the last of the bikers were let out into the night, the room lingered in a strange in-between state, suspended somewhere between shock and release. The chaos had passed, but its imprint remained, etched into overturned chairs, scuffed floors, and the uneasy expressions of those who had witnessed how quickly an ordinary place could become something else entirely. Chuck stood beside his daughter near their booth, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the table. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation was fading now, leaving behind a deep, steady exhaustion. It was not the kind that made his knees weak or his vision blur, but the kind that settled into muscles and bones, reminding him that action always carried a price, even when it was necessary. His daughter sat down slowly, careful with her movements. The paramedic had finished examining her, assuring her that there was no serious injury, only soreness that would linger for a while. Still, she touched her hair now and then, as if half expecting pain to flare again, as if her body had not yet accepted that the danger was gone. Her face was pale, but her eyes were clear, alert, taking in the room with a new awareness. Across the diner, officers continued to speak with witnesses, their voices calm and methodical. One by one, people stepped forward to give their accounts. They spoke with a confidence that had not been there before, no longer afraid of attracting attention, no longer pretending they had seen nothing. The waitress stood among them, her shoulders squared despite the tremor that still ran through her hands. She described what she had seen, her voice gaining strength as she went, as if each word reclaimed a small piece of control that had been taken from her earlier. Chuck listened without interrupting, without inserting himself into the center of the narrative. He answered questions when they were directed at him, clearly and concisely, but he did not dominate the space. The truth did not require embellishment. It stood on its own, supported by too many voices and too much evidence to be easily distorted. One of the officers approached him again, this time with a clipboard in hand. His demeanor was respectful, professional, and quietly acknowledging. He asked Chuck to confirm a few details to clarify the sequence of events. Chuck did so calmly, focusing on facts rather than emotion. He described the moment his daughter had been grabbed, the steps he had taken to stop it, and the way the situation had unfolded afterward. He did not exaggerate the biker's aggression, nor did he minimize it. He simply told it as it had been. The officer nodded, jotting notes, then looked up and met Chuck's eyes. There was no accusation there, only understanding. He told Chuck that based on the statements and recordings, it was clear who had initiated the violence. Chuck accepted the words without visible reaction. He had not acted for validation or approval. He had acted because he had no other choice. Nearby, his daughter spoke quietly with another officer, her voice steady but subdued. She recounted what she had experienced, her hands clasped tightly together as she spoke. Chuck watched her from a short distance, careful not to hover, but ready to step in if she faltered. She did not. She finished her statement, nodded when the officer thanked her, and returned to Chuck's side with a small, weary exhale. As the formalities continued, the diner's staff began to reclaim their space. A cook emerged from the kitchen, his apron stained, his face drawn, and started righting chairs and wiping down tables. The waitress accepted a glass of water from a customer and drank it in small sips, her gaze unfocused as she stared through the window at the flashing lights outside. Someone else picked up a fallen napkin dispenser and set it back on the counter, as if restoring it might somehow restore the sense of order that had been lost. Outside, the parking lot was crowded with patrol cars and an ambulance, their lights painting the night in pulses of red and blue. The bikers were lined up near the vehicles, some sitting on the curb with their hands cuffed, others being guided carefully into the backs of cars. Their earlier bravado was gone. They avoided looking back at the diner, avoided looking at the people they had tried to intimidate. Reality had stripped them of the illusion that numbers and noise could protect them from consequences. Chuck watched as the man who had grabbed his daughter was loaded into the back of a cruiser, his movements stiff, his head bowed. There was no satisfaction in the sight, no sense of triumph. Only a quiet acknowledgement that actions, once taken, could not be undone. The road they had chosen had led them here, and now they would have to walk the rest of it without shortcuts. When the officers finally told Chuck and his daughter that they were free to leave, the words landed with a strange weight. Freedom, after a moment like that, felt different. It was not light or celebratory. It was heavy, edged with responsibility and memory. Chuck nodded his thanks, gathered their things, and guided his daughter toward the door. As they stepped outside, the cool night air washed over them, sharp and grounding. The noise of the diner faded behind them, replaced by the low murmur of radios and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. The sky above was dark and wide, indifferent to what had happened beneath it. Stars shone faintly, uncaring witnesses to human conflict. They walked slowly to the car. Chuck unlocked it and held the door open for his daughter, watching as she eased into the seat. He closed the door gently, then moved around to the driver's side and sat down, resting his hands on the steering wheel without turning the key right away. For a moment, they sat in silence, the interior of the car familiar and safe, a stark contrast to the chaos they had just left. His daughter broke the silence first, not with words, but with a long, shaky breath. She leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the tension drain. When she opened them again, she looked at Chuck, and there was something new in her expression. Not fear, not admiration, but understanding. The understanding that the world could be cruel and unpredictable, and that protection sometimes came at a cost. Chuck met her gaze and gave a small nod. He did not speak. There were things that could be said, lessons that could be drawn, but none of them felt necessary in that moment. What mattered had already been proven. He turned the key in the ignition, and the engine came to life with a familiar purr. As they pulled out of the parking lot and back onto the road, the diner receded into the darkness, its lights shrinking until they were just another glow among many along the highway. The night swallowed it whole, leaving only memory behind. The road stretched ahead once more, quiet and unassuming, as though nothing had happened at all. Yet both of them knew that something had changed, not in the world at large, which would continue much as it always had, but within them. A boundary had been crossed and defended. A lesson had been learned, not through words, but through action and consequence. They drove on in silence, the miles unfolding steadily beneath them. The ordinary had returned, but it no longer felt naive. It felt earned. If this story kept you watching till the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next intense stories. Check out the other videos on the channel for more moments like this, and share this video with someone who needs to see it.